Hello. Sorry about that. I had a little bit of a OBS setup problem there. Welcome to Charting the Galaxy. I am John Schaefer, and today I'm going to be sharing with you some of my favorite techniques for painting and assembling and creating terrain for tabletop miniatures games. Um, there's a lot of different things to kind of consider. There's a lot of different avenues you can go down, and there's also just a lot of new technology these days when it comes to creating terrain. So I think I'm going to just kind of show some relatively easy techniques that can be applicable across a wide variety of different applications, um, and try to just kind of narrow down some of those like just basics to inspire you to create your own cool battlefields. I'm going to cover primarily two main things. And to start off with, I'm going to show you all how I go about taking just some standard kind of simple bark chips to create some pieces kind of like this one right here, with some insulation foam, some bark chips, some sand, and a little bit of time-honored elbow grease. So here we go. So let's go ahead and get started here. All right, so this is the piece that we have that I was kind of mentioning before. These are just standard bark chips that you can find at any home improvement store. You can usually find it in any sort of landscaping, or just even just going out into the park. You can find these things pretty readily, no matter where you live in the world. They look very similar to this. You've probably seen them out and about. And this is essentially just these bark chips kind of like put in at a jaunty angle to kind of suggest some eroded and alien kind of landscapes. I think we kind of see some things similar to this in some of the desert landscapes. But what's cool about this overall technique and this approach is that you could also apply snow or other kind of ground cover to create different environments if you really wanted to. So that kind of snow appearance on this base would just look like a snowdrift that's kind of piled up around these rocks. It's a pretty versatile technique. It's super cheap, and it's a great way to get some nice area terrain for your board without a ton of effort. So after I kind of primed and did all this, I did a little bit of airbrushing here around each individual rock to add a little bit of that red tone to it, which I think just kind of adds a little bit more to the visual appeal. But you can kind of paint it however you want to. Paint it to match the miniatures of your bases, and that's kind of what I've done here, is that I've kind of painted this up to match the miniatures that I have at home. So to go about this process, I have just taken a piece of plastic card or sheet styrene. You can usually get this at any sort of hobby store, or if you can just find any sort of like plastic packaging, anything like that. You want to get something that's probably, this is maybe a little bit on the thin side. I might want to go like 2 millimeters thick or so, something along those lines. And this is just insulation foam that comes in large sheets, and this is just shaved down with a hobby knife. I like to use kind of one of these retractable blades like this to cut this guy down, and then I just use a little bit of 80 grit sandpaper over top of that, and then just sand it all smooth. So once you get your overall hill kind of sorted, and what I'll do is I'll have like this large sheet of insulation foam to begin with, and I'll take whatever the base is that I want to utilize. The previous example that I showed you actually uses masonite or MDF, which is like a really kind of heavy duty material. You need some power tools to cut through that stuff. So it's really durable, really long lasting, but it's a little cumbersome if you don't have the tools for it. So you can get a very similar overall effect by using something thin like this. There's some stuff from some sign companies too that you can pick up that can also be very helpful. But the gist is that we take this insulation foam, we attach it to this base, and then we use a filler. In this case, I am using some adhesive tile grout, some sanded tile grout, which you can get at any sort of home improvement store. It's used for grouting the tiles in your base, your bathroom, etc. And I use that as a filler. I like that stuff because it has a little bit of sand in it, and it will dry very rigid and very hard, and it has a slight texture and tooth to it, and it's also water soluble, so you can use a brush and a little bit of water to smooth out the edges and get it all cleaned up. So I'm just going to use a hot glue gun here to adhere this piece of foam to my base first, and I'm going to try to keep the hot glue from getting too close to the edges here, so it won't bleed out over the edges very much. And we'll just get that guy locked in there. one issue with the hot glue. Sometimes it leaves these little spider webby string things, so make sure to clear those things up. So after you have that in place, I've taken some of these bark chips, and what I've done to these is I first took a small kind of like handsaw, something like this. It's a real thin kind of razor saw, and I cut these things down kind of at a slight angle. So I would just take one of these things, and then I would turn this thing sideways, and I would kind of saw through it until I had a nice flat edge on one bottom side. And once you have all those together, then I like to take a little bit of wood glue and I will thin it down with some water. So I'll go ahead and just do that, just kind of show you the consistency that I typically go with for this. Okay, and I'll just take a little bit of water and this wood glue, I'll thin it down, and it's probably about 2 parts glue to 1 part water or so. But you want to thin it down enough that it's going to get into the cracks and crevices of these little bark chips and seal them up, and it'll make them a lot more durable in the long run. And then you just want to, I usually will just paint one side of them, because if you paint both sides and then set it down on the table, sometimes it'll actually glue to the table. So I'll just paint one side, let them dry, and then flip them over and then paint the other side. And then while those are drying, I can go about doing some other steps in this whole process. So I've just essentially got a glue-laden bark chip there that I'll set aside. I already prepared some of these ahead of time. So for each of these, I'm just going to kind of find the angle that I really like here. I think like having these things kind of up on the crest makes it a little bit more dramatic and a little cooler looking. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this and I'm going to push it down pretty firmly into the actual foam, so I can see a little bit of an indent there. And then I will use my hobby knife to just kind of carve out a little place for that to rest inside of that. And just kind of tidy that up a little bit. Let me grab an X-Acto knife. This will probably be a little bit easier to use. So just mind your fingers, cut away from yourself whenever you can. And we're just going to make like a nice little shelf for that bark chip to rest on and go over top of. With that noise, a little scratchy. Okay, and then once we've kind of have like our little indentation there, we'll take a little bit more hot glue, apply that in. A little bit here on the bottom, and you can use a little bit of this hot glue to act as a filler too, if you want to, if you have like a little bit of a gap there. Take this guy and just kind of push him into that little berm there. And we'll continue the process, but for the sake of expediency, I'm going to just kind of get to the filler stage here and just kind of show you one example here of how I would fill in this rock. And then I'll use this other example that I have to show you how I will texture the whole thing with sand and get it ready for priming. So this is the paste here. You can see it's very soft, and I like to use a kind of a junky brush to just gather up some of this stuff here. Oops. And just kind of push it down and mash it down over top of the seam in between the rock and the surface. This sanded tile grout can also just be like a good overcoat over top of all this foam that will add extra strength to it as well. So I'll usually just use this and paint over almost this entire surface and just smooth it all out over top as I go. And then make sure that you also get on the underside of this as well. And this will just kind of help fill in a lot of these cracks and crevices. And this material is great if you decide that you wanted to kind of scratch build your own kind of Tatooine style buildings and you wanted that kind of cool crumbly stucco texture on the exterior. This stuff is great for that. It's going to add strength to your projects. You can also use this as a texturizer for 3D prints if you really wanted to. Just kind of fill in some of the print lines if you really prefer, but generally speaking, I just like to use it for kind of scratch building terrain and just kind of creating some natural rock features that'll go alongside some other terrain pieces I have, like the Imperial Bunker or any gantryways or little like general terrain features that I might want to use. Anywho, so yeah, so we'll kind of continue that whole process. You apply that filler over top. If you want to try to get rid of those, any sort of brush strokes that you have in there, don't be afraid to just kind of take your brush and just go back into it and just stipple a little bit. Just like kind of jab at it a little to kind of mask a little bit of that, those brush strokes and those perpendicular lines that you get as you're smoothing all this stuff out. So you set that aside to dry. It'll probably take about an hour or two. I think you can also, use some of that filler and smooth out the transition in between the foam and the actual base itself. When applying that stuff over top, it'll actually add a little bit of strength and rigidity to this. So it's a generally good approach. This kind of shows you an example that's just the flat piece and then some of these pieces over top. I did this, probably about an hour ago, and it's dry enough now at this point that I could actually apply glue over top and texture it. So that's what I'm going to do next. So I'm going to take some of the glue that I had before, and for this I'm going to need a tub. So I just get like a large Tupperware tub of a sand mixture. I have one kind of set aside specifically for terrain, and it's got a mix of small rocks and finer sand in there too, and I think it looks a little bit more natural for the overall finish. So yeah, all we're going to do is just take a little bit of this, and I use wood glue. I think it has a little bit of a tighter bond than standard like PVA or white glue. And we're just going to paint around this just like we would do a base on a miniature. And just go around here, dodge around all these rocks or any areas where you don't want it to be. And then once you have all of the surface covered all the way to the edge, and if you're working with like a really large piece, don't be afraid to kind of work on it in sections. Like you can just kind of do this part and then, texture it. Because if you wait too long, some of your glue might actually start to dry as you are applying it. Makes you want ice cream, yeah. It looks like ice cream, but man, it does not taste that good. I have made the mistake of licking a brush after I have dipped it in this stuff, and it was not great. Okay, so we kind of textured this whole thing, and then rather than just like submerging into this thing, what I like to do is just hold it up from above, and yeah, just kind of sprinkle the sand over top of it and texture it all. Dump off the excess, set it aside to dry, and then it's probably going to benefit you if you just do a lot of these all at one time. And while this one is drying, you can kind of move on to the next one, so on and so forth. So that's, roughly how that looks prior to paint. Then we'll apply multiple coats over top and start dry brushing it from the darkest color up to the lightest. I usually find with when painting terrain that you're going to get the best effects and the fastest overall painting time if you start dark and then work your way up lighter. Using techniques like dry brushing, sponging, which I'm going to show here in a second, or just basic layering as you're going up and moving upwards. So to kind of illustrate that general concept, I have a ruined ATST here, one of my favorite terrain pieces that we made. And this was essentially just airbrushed with a number of different colors. I start off with a darker color. You can achieve something very similar with spray cans, but in essence, what we have done is that we have gone through and painted most of this stuff with the airbrush in gray, all these rocks, all this base color here. And then after we've gotten all of those messy stages done, then we go back in with a smaller brush and we will paint in all of the ground cover with whatever base coat color that you use on the rest of your terrain. In this case, I like to just use bulk acrylics. You don't have to buy or utilize miniature paints for all this. I think another great route is if you go to a home improvement store and you ask them for a sample, like a sample color. It usually costs about $5. You can get any color that they have a little card for. You can even bring in your own paints and they can color match it, and you can get like a little tub of this stuff for very, very little money. Let me grab an example just so I can show you real quick. All right, and we're back. Yeah, so it's just one of these guys. It just comes in like this little $5 bottle. I think this one might actually be white. Oh no, it's kind of a bone color. So I would use that for like the later highlights that I have on my terrain. But yeah, I think that you can save a lot of money. You can also just experiment with a lot of other colors if you utilize those samples from home improvement stores. So yeah, that is my preferred material. So anyway, I'm going to go through here and I'm going to do a little bit of just basic dry brushing. I think that everybody's pretty familiar with the overall concept, but it is a technique that is going to be amazingly useful for creating terrain. I think you're really going to want to make sure that you have like a paper towel or something that has like a slight tooth to it or is a little porous to be able to kind of dry up the paint. The important thing here is that we make sure that we have our brush itself is pretty much just bone dry as we go through. So I've got a kind of a nice tan here that is like the next color that I use in my basing scheme on my miniatures. It is called Arabic Shadow from Scale Color. And then I've taken almost all of the paint off of my brush here, kind of moved it to the sides, and I just have this kind of brush that's like a nice flat. I like these quite a bit. And then you're just going to drag it across these raised areas and all this sand texture in here. And you want to try to dodge around any of the surrounding rocks as much as possible. And you also want to make sure that you kind of change direction as you go and that you're using all sides of the brush as you do it. I think it's also very handy while you are dry brushing to have a rag nearby. I've got one down here. Have a rag nearby and a little bit of water in case that you do kind of go outside the lines a little bit and you get a little bit of paint on, say, rocks or something like that. You can kind of wipe it away, much like I just did there. So yeah, we'll just kind of continue around here, lightly dry brush all this ground cover up as we kind of progress around the miniature. And then once we have all this, because we are invariably going to go outside the lines just a little bit from time to time, and we'll want to tidy things up. So I like to go back in, just like I do with bases, is I'll do all the dry brushing first. I'll get all this stuff done, and then I'll go back in with some more careful painting afterwards and tidy up the rocks or any other areas where this dry brushing step kind of got outside of the lines a little bit. Just kind of continue around here as much as we can. This is, Will just did a very good example utilizing makeup brushes for kind of larger, when painting larger vehicles. I find that a makeup brush, when you're doing terrain like this, they're so large that it's sometimes it's kind of hard to get it into the nooks and crannies where you really need them, unless you use like a really small one. But the soft bristles are great. It'll make sure that it kind of really sticks to skimming to the surfaces of the miniature and keeps a lot of the paint out of the cracks and the crevices. But I just use like old nasty brushes for a lot of dry brushing, and it's just kind of whatever I have handy. Like I'm not too picky. I think that you'll find that you don't necessarily have to have the most perfect tool for the job every time. It's a lot of times it's just working with what you got and just getting cool results and learning about it along the way. And kind of continue around here, and then I'd like to do like a couple layers of dry brushing here, kind of bringing it up, but I won't spend like a ton of time on this. This is just a very established technique. Everybody's kind of seen it, but for just those few people joining us that have never really painted terrain before, or it's kind of a mystery to them and they haven't had the opportunity to check out some other videos or other things that they see online, I figure I just kind of cover it because it is like just a fundamental part of terrain. So much so that I'll often use a brush like this size when it comes to doing like larger pieces. If I'm doing like really big massive buildings, or kind of like that this rock outcropping piece that I showed you previously, this one, I'd use a brush of that size, and I'd go through there and I would dry brush all of the ground cover and then go back in and pick out the rocks as I go through and do it. So while I don't wash my brush at all in this whole process, it's very important that you keep it bone dry. It's like you just want to keep this one off to the side the entire time. I mean, wash it out at the end of the night. Obviously, you don't want it to gum up on you, but for right now, it's just going to stay dry the entire time, and I'll just mix in colors because I'm not really too precious about the exact shades that I'm throwing down on here, as long as I just get progressively lighter colors as I progress. Yeah, terrain is definitely a bit of a messy process. I do highly recommend that you just set aside a place where you can. I find like places with hardwood floors or like concrete or something like that is great, because you can, if you have sand or any of this other material, it's really easy to sweep up. I highly recommend you don't do it over a carpeted surface if you can avoid it, just because the cleanup is kind of a hassle, and terrain is going to get everywhere. That's, in my opinion, part of the fun is just getting your hands dirty and working on this stuff. So you can also use this base coat color a little bit to just dry brush a little bit of the edges here. If I wanted to pick out some of these other surfaces, I would probably, if I was going to continue to paint this, you know, start to edge in and highlight some little areas here. But generally speaking, I just kind of want to go through, dry brush up in all these rocks as much as I can. And then I can switch colors, and I can start to do the same process for some of these rocks and start to pick those things out as well. And in this case, I kind of like that kind of a bit of a bluish tone to the rocks alongside these. So I'll use a little bit of this Grapheno gray. It's got a little blue in it. Just a lighter shade in general. And same story, you just want to kind of like lightly whisk over top as much as you can. And just pick out some of these rocks as you go. And for this initial dry brush, I'm going to do it fairly heavily, going over top of all these. And then I can go in again with a makeup brush or something a little bit finer if I so chose to pick all those things out. Okay, so you're starting to see, you know, they're starting to pick out a little bit, starting to pop a little bit more. Mix in a little bit of a lighter color here. And just hit the very tops of them. You just want a little bit of contrast, I think, on each of these. And you can be as deliberate and as careful as you want to with this, but I'm essentially just going through, just trying to get the base impression down across all this. And this approach where you have kind of like an airbrush in conjunction with dry brushing is going to really speed up your overall process, but you don't have to have a dry brush in order to do terrain effectively. I think you can get a lot of it done with spray cans. I've got a bunker over here that I started that I'm going to show you next that essentially just did kind of like an overspray over top of things. And then in order to paint all of the flat areas on it, I opted to use a sponge and stippling technique, which gives you kind of like a cool mottled effect overall as you progress. So it's starting to pop out a little bit more. I think at this stage, you know, I would, you know, spend a little bit more time, refine some of the areas, pop out some of those edges that I really want to achieve some contrast on, maybe add some grass tufts, etc. And then I can also use a little bit of a shade or a wash in here to kind of chase around some of these rocks and achieve an effect kind of similar to some of the other bases that I've done. I guess also kind of similar to this. I really like how that looks when you have kind of a darker ring around the rocks to kind of divide them. So yeah, kind of progress with that whole process. So that's, you know, basics and overall gist of just of dry brushing and kind of utilizing that technique when you're painting stuff. Doing the largest areas first with a large brush is going to save you a lot of time. Then go back in with a little bit more careful painting and start to tighten it up as you go and just kind of build up the colors. So the next little bit that I'd like to talk about is what I mentioned before. So I've got this bunker over here. And this bunker is in different stages of being complete. So this rear portion here shows the color that I primed it. So this is a just kind of like a camouflaged color spray paint. This is the cap to the spray can right here. Kind of an olive green. And I chose this because I'm going for kind of that that Endor bunker look that has that kind of like built up green in the cracks and crevices where lichen and mold and other stuff is kind of like collected in this kind of damp kind of forest. So I start off with the space coat here, just a flat primer over top. I just got that primer from a home improvement store. It's just a flat camouflage spray paint is what it's called. Make sure that you use flat paints whenever you can. You don't really want to use satin or gloss. It's going to do weird stuff to the paint that you put over top of it, and it's going to have a kind of a glossy finish. So the next stage here after that is, this thing is also that same color, but what I did is I took my spray can. Let me grab one for an example here. Okay, so I took my spray can and then I sprayed. I can't actually do this, while I'm streaming, but I sprayed from about, a distance of, I'd say, about 15 inches or so, about this far. And when I did it, I was very careful, especially on these kind of like stepped edges as they kind of step down, is that I would spray it, I would tilt it up like this, and I would spray it across this way. So the spray would go across here and not get down into those cracks and those crevices. So it's just kind of like an overspray technique. You can get a lot more dialed in and tidy results if you utilize a airbrush, of course. But this is mostly just showing that you can achieve similar results and overall a very similar effect with standard spray cans. Just make sure that you have a real clean nozzle on them, and that you you don't have any sort of spatter with the paint. Like kind of spray it off to the side and then kind of bring it over top of the terrain piece as you are painting it. So the overall effect here is that we've got this kind of like nice gray, but down in the cracks you've got a little bit of that green that kind of like that hints in there. So after that point, I then started to utilize a sponge and some thin paints and a little bit of dry brushing to start to get it more akin to this. And this is kind of closer to what I want it to look like in the end. So this is just the side that is just straight kind of oversprayed, utilizing that kind of two color combo of the camo green and the kind of medium gray. And then this version, I've kind of gone through and I used a sponge to kind of stipple over top of it to achieve what I was after. Let me see if I can find that sponge. Here we go. So for that, I just kind of use one of these. It's one of these natural sponges. I think, a lot of home improvement folks will use this for like kind of faux finishing on their walls and stuff. You can usually get it at any sort of craft store. They sell them in bulk. They're super cheap. You want to make sure that you just run it under a sink first and then squeeze all the water out of it because they are kind of rigid to begin with, and you want this to be nice and soft and pliable and slightly damp, just ever so slightly damp, a little bit of water in there, which will help kind of thin the paints as you proceed. So kind of showing you here on the interior here, that is just like a standard wall on the inside, and then over here on this flip, this kind of shows you what it looks like after you have gone through and sponged it and then lightly dry brushed it to hit up those edges as a final step. And it's nice because if you just try to go in and dry brush all of that at one time, you're probably going to get a very streaky result. You're going to have a lot of visible brush strokes in there that's going to kind of mar the overall finish of what you're trying to achieve. But the sponge inherently, if you build it up in kind of gradual layers as you proceed, it's going to kind of create a nice mottled effect that's going to be similar to concrete or aged steel. Yeah, and I just think it looks a little bit more natural, and it's pretty fast. You don't have to worry about breaking out the airbrush and creating a mess that way. So let's kind of illustrate this this technique here. So what I like to use is I set up a palette with a piece of cardboard, and for that I just use like a little clipboard, and then I just have this piece of cardboard that I cut off of a box or whatever. And I like this because this paper is going to absorb a little bit of paint. It's great for dry brushing if you're trying to work out a lot of the excess paint on your brush. And a paper towel is just proving to be a little bit too thin as you proceed. So yeah, I'm going to apply my first layer here with just standard scale color gray. That's going to be my primary color that I'm going to use to build it up. And I'm just going to apply a little bit of that to the base. And then if you were, if you're doing a lot of this stuff, again, you could also use any of your house paints or any other bulk paint that you would get, some acrylic stuff. But when it comes to the sponge itself, you want to use a surface that has a little bit of tooth to it, but is also a little bit irregular. Like you don't necessarily want like a really, really jagged version like this, unless you want like a really staggered pattern, like it's like really spotty and all over the place. But I want something a little bit tighter, and I want it to be kind of spread a little bit more evenly across. So I'm going to go through here and I'm going to just dab in a little bit of this on my brush here on this sponge. And then starting with the raised surfaces, and in the case of the side here, what I would do is I would first kind of just sponge down this main section right here. And if you just have one pass, you can see it's very kind of spotty, but we're going to go over this in multiple passes that's going to smooth that out. And you don't want to apply a lot of pressure here. You want to just kind of like lightly dab it. You don't want it to get down into the cracks as much as you can. You want this to just kind of like apply evenly across all of these surfaces, all these raised surfaces, and leave a little bit of those previous colors down in the cracks to give you a little bit of definition and help refine some of the volumes and stuff that you have on the scenery piece. So as you do this, I think it's also kind of helpful to just kind of turn your hand a little bit. Make sure to not push and turn, because then you're going to start to get streaks. But before you press, pick it up, turn it, pick it up, turn it as you kind of move around. So in this case, I'm going to kind of focus a lot of my effort here in the center of these channels, because I want it to taper from a lighter color here down into the darker color towards the edges. A little bit over here on this side. And because this is like ever so slightly damp, it keeps the paint nice and thin. It's going on in a pretty flat coat. It's not going to build up and add a lot of extra tooth or texture that you might think you would achieve. I think that's another reason why you want to make sure that your sponge is just ever so slightly damp. We'll move around here, kind of sponge these areas. And then I think it's a good idea to kind of let this dry a little bit before layers, because paint when it's dry versus paint while it's still wet, it usually looks quite a bit different. So rather than just kind of like heaping on more and more layers over top of this already wet paint, I'm just going to kind of let that area dry, and then I'm just going to move to another section here on the interior. So we'll just start to stipple over here on this side, and I'll kind of show you how I'll approach this interior section here. So again, kind of like we're really trying to like focus on the raised areas of these rails first. And then we're just going to try to like move around and sponge out all of these other surfaces. And it's going to take a little bit of time, but you can see we're starting to kind of build that up. But because we're not pushing too hard, any of those little cracks down there, they're still going to stay that darker color. Very similar to, you know, if we were going to go through and dry brush all this stuff. So I also find that, you know, if you take the sponge here and you kind of fold it over and you get like a little bit of a sharper point, that's really going to help you get down into some of the nooks and crevices here. Let me get my palette back over here, get a bit more paint going. And then after you have this overall texture done and down, and these kind of middle values in, then like another dry brush over top just to hit those very edges. And that's when I'm going to use a real soft brush, like a makeup brush for that, because that will just really make sure that it keeps the paint on the very, very edges. Luke Eddy, he thinks magnets are next level hobbying. I agree. They're certainly cool, but sometimes like the whole magnetization of things can be so fiddly. I've known people that have like magnetized every weapon option possible for a miniature, but they only really used 2. I'm like, was it worth it? I don't know. If you enjoyed the process, then yeah, of course it was. All right, just kind of keep moving around, keep sponging. Oh, that little spot down there, too dark, do not like. So I think I'm gonna make sure that I have that brush handy, or I'm sorry, that rag handy, a little bit of water, and then I can just go through here and I can just clean that off real quick. But before I go back into that section, I want to make sure that dries a little bit more, so I don't, you know, go over top of wet paint and it's going to start to diffuse my my stippling effect. You want to kind of focus a little bit more effort up here towards the top and in the center of each of these little shapes here. And keep moving it around so you guys can see. It's kind of a tough angle. And you can probably see this one better. Probably help if my head wasn't in the way. All right. Move around here, continue this process. But this is largely it. I mean, I think that, just building up lighter colors over top of it, this is going to help to just paint a lot of these really big flat areas that you have, which is oftentimes the real problem for people when it comes to painting terrain, the thing that they're most intimidated by. And they're like, oh, the only answer is an airbrush. The only way that I can possibly do this is airbrushing. But I think that if you spray cans a little bit of this technique, you can also produce really great effects, especially if the texture of the terrain piece that you're doing lends itself to it. If it has that kind of mottled look, if it's like old and weathered and the paint is worn, yeah, it can look very cool. And this will just be built up over time, just as a, kind of moving around to each one of these spots and just flattening it all out and then just working with progressively lighter and lighter colors as you progress. Okay, well, we've got about 10 more minutes left, so I'm going to move over to just a little bit of the shading here and just like this overall effect and what I'm doing to achieve all this. And this is it's a pretty straightforward technique that is, we're going to use a thinned down green paint. I'm going to mix a little bit of medium and stuff into it to just kind of thin it down a little bit. But you could just use the paint in straight water if you wanted to as well. That also works just fine. So I'll just load up my palette a little bit here. Take a little bit of this darker green first. And then I'm just going to use a fairly good sized brush, something akin to like this. Just a nasty little terrain brush. I'll just thin it down with a little bit of water here instead of the medium, just to show you that you can just achieve it without a special mix of something fancy. And then I just want to focus a lot of this paint into just like the very cracks alongside each of these. And I'm going to paint like 2 or 3 of them. And then before they dry, take my brush, I clean it off, and then I can just kind of feather out those edges. Much like what we do when we're painting miniatures, we're just kind of using a little bit of paint, a little bit of moisture here to feather out and dither the edges here to make a nice smooth transition and create a better overall effect. But you can just kind of apply like the thick paint first and then go back into it. And if you get a little bit too much, again, don't be afraid to use a paper towel, a little bit of water, kind of erase a little bit of this stuff if it gets a little bit unruly. And here a little bit too. So are there any specific techniques or anything in the chat that you guys would like us to either cover today or in a future stream? I'm always kind of curious to find out where people's heads are at when it comes to terrain and working with just larger miniatures in general, right? Like just the scale is oftentimes what changes the technique and the approach. Cool. Now I'm going to do another layer over top of that with a bit of a more vibrant green. In this case, I'm going to use this Vallejo, this golden olive. Yeah, the next stream coming up, Dallas is going to be covering painting competition level minis, which is going to be super interesting. There's just like a lot of subtlety. There's a lot of different strategies when it comes to like painting a miniature for a competition as opposed to just getting something ready for a tabletop. And I think that his techniques are certainly going to be insightful. Should be very cool. Block and static grass technique, not just pre-made clumps. Sure, of course. So static grass is like super interesting. It's it originally got that name because model train railroaders often use a electric device that uses static electricity to cause those little fibers to stand up on end. And those tools are kind of expensive, but most people use just static grass. They'll just put down a little bit of grass and then just sprinkle over top of it, and then just kind of like let it sit and cement. I think that the tufts in particular are very popular for people because it achieves that effect of the strands of grass standing up on end in a pre-made tuft. But I find sometimes, because the tufts are oftentimes a very similar size, it can look a little formulaic when people are starting to apply those on their base. So I think, you know, doing ground cover with some variety of different effects is going to produce better results. And I'll be covering that in a basing stream that I'm going to be doing tomorrow. I'll be covering some basing techniques in there. I guess that's a good question. I got a little bit of time to prepare tonight. What kind of basing schemes do you guys want to see? I was planning on doing kind of standard Tatooine desert. I was going to do a snow base. I was going to do a little lava stuff. I was going to show you how to make scenic bases that have items kind of sunk into them. Kind of very similar to what we did with the rocks and these terrain pieces. I think like basing and terrain has a lot of similar DNA. They kind of like kind of approached it in a very similar way. Cool. So I've got this this kind of green established here, and just kind of like this modeled pattern all across. Before I would actually go through, and I would probably just want to let this dry completely before I go through and actually dry brush it. But I am going to do just a little bit of dry brushing here. Just again, just kind of showing you, just using a makeup brush, something like really soft, really soft, and bristles over top to go over there. And I'm just going to do kind of a little bit of quick dry brushing, and I think that's most of my time for today. Thank you all for spending a bit of time here and watching me paint a bit of terrain. This is something that is near and dear to my heart, something I really enjoy in my free time, and I love being able to talk to people about it and share general techniques. I'm just going to go through here, and I'm going to start to dry brush these areas. Oh, that's a little too heavy, so make sure to get some of that out. And you want to go against the grain as much as you can and try to hit those edges and pick those up, because what you're really trying to do is just hit the very raised parts with this technique to add a little bit of contrast and just define the forms a bit better. Here, I'm going to dry brush these spots. And if I see any spots here where it got a little bit too heavy, you can always just kind of tidy those up a little bit. Don't be afraid to go back in and erase a little. It's going to be way better than if you just have like these kind of messy brush strokes on the edges of things. Street bases, city stuff, yeah, that would be very cool. I would like to see that. Ice and stalactites. Yeah, I've seen some cool stuff with I don't know if you guys have ever seen it before, but there's like a UV resin that you can get. So it's like it's a liquid, but you shine a UV light on it and it solidifies into a clear kind of plasticky material. It's super neat, and that's something that I wanna mess around with a little bit. So this is this is kind of showing you the basic approach here. So base coat with a nice undertone color. So if you're doing like, say, something that's very deserty, you could base coat it with, you know, a color similar to this, you know, something that's very dusty. Overspray it one time with either an airbrush or with spray cans. They both work just fine. Utilize some sponging techniques to kind of get the overall kind of values kind of like popping a little bit and showing up a little bit better. Then kind of a final dry brush over top to kind of like lock in everything else, and you start to get like some nice defined surfaces that are going to look great on your tabletop and help define your battlefield as you progress. Well, I think, everyone, that is my time to cover terrain. There's so much more to talk about. I'm sure that we'll have some future streams discussing more terrain techniques and talking about different specific applications. And I look forward to joining you guys on those future streams. So coming up next, we've got The Path to the Worthy with Dallas Kemp. He's going to be sharing his expert techniques with you to get ready for competition painting. He's going to have a lot to share. And he's going to get started here in about another 15 minutes. So thank you again for joining me. I will be back here tomorrow covering batch painting and painting squads as opposed to single miniatures, and also doing a segment on basing as well. So I look forward to it, and I'll see you then. Take care.